Good evening and welcome to the very first event of the New York Studio School's Fall 2022 Evening Lecture Series. I may be a new face to many of you. My name's Kara Carmack and I'm the new Exhibitions and Public Programs Officer at the New York Studio School. And tonight I'm very honored to present Michael Ray Charles and Cherise Smith in conversation. Thank you all for joining us, and a special thanks to Michael and Cherise for sharing their time and work with us. Before we begin, I would like to note that the New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is free to the public with support from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and many individual contributors like you. Please do consider making a donation to keep our evening lecture series free by clicking on the support button on our homepage at www.nyss.org. I'll introduce Michael and Cherise in a moment, but first I would like to point out the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please do feel free to type in a question at any point during the talk, and we look forward to a lively Q&A at the end. Now, introductions. Michael Ray Charles is a chair in African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and currently a faculty member in the School of Design and Creative Technologies. Among varied international exhibitions and awards, including the prestigious Rome Prize Fellowship of the American Academy in Rome, he's among the first group of artists featured in the award-winning PBS series Art 21, Art in the 21st Century. He has upcoming exhibitions at the Templon Gallery in New York City and the Hilliard Museum of Art in Lafayette, the Hilliard Museum of Art in Lafayette, Louisiana. Cherise Smith is the Joseph D. Jamail Chair in African American Studies in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research centers on African American art, the history of photography, performance, and contemporary art. She's the author of Michael Ray Charles, Studies in Blackness, published by the University of Texas Press in 2020, which won the Charles C. Eldredge Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in American Art from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So please join me in offering a very warm virtual welcome to Michael Ray Charles and Cherise Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you so much for inviting us to have a conversation with the New York Studio School. And thanks everyone else who has participated in making this event happen. Michael, do you want to say anything?
Just thank you for the opportunity to speak about my work and ideas and to share the stage with my colleague, Cherise Smith. She wrote a wonderful book. I'm still impressed every time I think about it. So it's just, I'm thankful to have an opportunity to be able to share with you guys.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, so what we thought we would do is talk a little bit about the book, and then we will have a wide rambling conversation, and then we will open up for questions. So at this point, I'm going to try to share my screen and show you all some images. Okay, this is the cover of the book, Michael Ray Charles, a retrospective, and it is based on recent work that Michael did back in 2018. I will show you a bit more of this work in just a few minutes. The book opens with an interview with Michael Ray Charles and me that happened at the National Portrait Gallery back in 2016. In this way, you get to hear directly from the artist before you actually see his work. And then there is a beautiful selection of images that have been reproduced very beautifully in color with fantastic thick pages. Lots of work that has not been seen previously. So it's well worth checking out if and when you have an opportunity. The next part of the book is a long series of sections or chapters that really historicize Charles's work within the 1990s and the contemporary art scene. So there are sections that deal with stereotypes and the prevalence of stereotypes in the 1990s. It considers why stereotypes were of such critical interest to artists during the period, including Kara Walker and Charles. And talks about the rise of Charles with Shafrazi Gallery in the early to mid 1990s. It does a history of art that deals with stereotypes and that deals with Black memorabilia, as well as with what's sometimes called contemptible collectibles. Again, here is a very short history of African-American artists who also engaged with stereotypical subject matter in their own work. The book, Michael Ray Charles, a retrospective, also has a history of contemptible collectibles or Black memorabilia. What it tracks, what I track in the book, is how contemptible collectibles began to be collected in the 1980s. There is an uptick that happens with Marlon Riggs's ethnic notions, and then Black intellectuals and others begin to really collect Black collectibles and or Black memorabilia, contemptible collectibles. And I also talk about the collection of contemptible collectibles that Michael Ray Charles amassed and from which he works in his paintings and sculpture. So one of the other things that the book does that I think is really important to thinking about Charles's work is to see that he also works in sculpture, which is not something that is typically talked about. These are works that can be found in a park in Belgium. Another sculpture that was commissioned by Landmarks, which is the public art program on the University of Texas at Austin campus. This is cited within the Black and Latino Studies building, also the Gordon White building, as it's called. So this is work that has not really been seen very widely and really expands our understanding of what Charles's work does. There's recent work that Charles did as late as 2018, as these two prints from a portfolio show you. The portfolio is called Every Head is a World, Every World is a Head. And they are dealing with historic images and subject matter that, as his work is wont to do, also kind of deals with making work that looks as though it has been aged, as though it's from a different time period, a kind of anachronism. And then the last thing that I wanted to end on is an image of Charles at work on paintings that may end up in the shows that Kara mentioned that are happening in the spring. One is at Galleries Templon, which will be in New York in March of 2023, as well as an exhibition at the Hilliard Art Museum, which is in Lafayette, Louisiana. Interestingly, the Hilliard Museum exhibition will deal extensively with sculpture, so that is something to look out for. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing, and Michael and I will have a conversation. Welcome back.
Never left.
So, maybe the thing to start with is how has it been moving your studio? You've moved your studio from Houston back to Austin. You've changed spaces. So can you talk about that process? I imagine that studio artists who may be watching will be interested in hearing about that.
Well, the studio was, my main objective was getting it up and running um, as quickly as possible, and it was up and running. And the transition was smooth, but adjusting to new dynamics of a new place, getting to a studio, the studio's no longer at home. Just those kinds of things has led to some interesting thoughts in terms of how I engage the work. But in due time, I think I'll be back up to speed. It's just a matter of getting some momentum going with a number of works.
And did you find that there was a bit of a lag time as you kind of got adjusted to the new space, or did you really feel like you hit the ground running and, once you had things set up, you were able to get to work?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm someone that I never think of myself as, not painting. I think when I'm out and about in the world, I'm consuming ideas, I'm reaffirming thoughts, and I'm looking at things passively at times and even critically at other times. There are certain set ideas about culture and language that I try to pay attention to, and I think as I'm out and about, I'm consuming ideas. Once I'm in the studio, it's a matter of exploring what those ideas are. I'm out collecting things, ideas, images, moments. All of those things matter, and it comes into play when I come back into the studio. And I'm able to achieve a sustained level of creative interaction. And once that happens, it's like Sunday morning.
So when you came back to UT, you arrived to the Black and Latina Studies building, one floor of which had been installed with a great number of your works. I think there are maybe 10, 12, 13 of your works on display, along with the sculpture that is permanently installed in the building. Can you talk about what it was like to walk into a space that was both welcoming to you, but also, I think, a bit embarrassing for you?
Very embarrassing. Yeah, it's really good to be in this space for a number of reasons. I think I contributed to it in many ways conceptually early on. And now to really fully be a part of it in a different capacity, and this capacity is strengthening to me, both intellectually and creatively. And the first time I walked into the space and I saw so much work that was up, I started to I thought about making very specific phone calls to two persons in particular, whose names I won't mention, but it was good. I thought it was somewhat of a joke or something, but just the level of enthusiasm, I think, for me being back there and that display, it feels really good. A little awkward, but it feels really good.
Yeah. So let's turn to the topic of stereotypes and caricature, because I think sometimes we're talking about one and really we mean the other. Sometimes we're talking about both. You have made a career of dealing with the subject matter head on, sometimes sideways. How has your engagement with stereotypical images and stories changed over the course of your 30-something year career?
I rather naively made a decision to early on to seek the truth as if there was a singular interpretation or version of the truth. And I guess my naivete has been one of my strong points. It continues to inform or fuel my questioning of things. It's led me to some conclusions that propel me forward to think beyond where I've been with the work, and to continue to interrogate the subject matter and try to pull it apart in as many ways as possible. I made a commitment early on. I would say, you know, it wasn't so much that I've received a fair amount of success that led me to this conclusion, but my quest for understanding about these images goes really far back, and even as a kid, and I'm curious about what is it that makes the stereotypes remain. I'm curious about what systems are at play with the construction and the preservation of stereotypical imagery, its use within popular realms, its use within our communications, our abilities to communicate, and to a certain degree, it's a necessary evil. We deal in shorthand when we communicate. Words are symbols, images can be symbolic as well, and we abbreviate, shorten meaning to communicate through symbols. And I don't want to seem negative, but I sometimes I feel like the stereotypes, the racial stereotypes that we digest within Western culture, for the most part, they're not going anywhere. And I hesitate to hang my hat on they're forever in place, you know, but it's something that I continue to try to think about as each new day come into play, and language and meaning and interpretation shifts with its emphasis with what we consume, how we consume, technological advancements, the social dialogues, as well as the new generations coming into being and as matures and young adults.
It's interesting that we're talking about this. Of course, we're talking about it, but last week I taught your work in my course that's called The Black Figure in American Art and Culture. And that was on a Tuesday. And then on Thursday, students in the class had a presentation that dealt with interviews surrounding your work and contemptible collectibles or Black memorabilia. And in discussing the collecting of Black memorabilia, the students really had a hard time with the fact that one of the interlocutors in this printed interview was white, and that he had a collection of these materials, and they began to stereotype him. And so I stopped the class and I said to them, look, we're in a class to think critically about stereotypes and blanket mischaracterizations or characterizations of a particular ethnic group. So that does not give us license to make blanket statements and stereotypes about other racial groups. So let us be conscientious about how we talk about others. And so this example speaks to exactly what you're saying, that we use stereotypes and blanket statements and generalizations to categorize people. And sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's very hurtful, but it's a really challenging thing not to do. And we have to struggle to not do it.
You know, I think it's very difficult to struggle to not do it. Again, we naturally, I think, abbreviate to communicate certain ideas. And I think within the visual realm, it is the visual for me, whether it's two-dimensional, three-dimensional, or a moving image, I think the image typically follows the language in many respects. And I think how we explore being as descriptive as possible about the other, I think can lead to better representations of otherness, one, but one has to take into consideration power dynamics that come into play. And those power dynamics are, for the most part, handed down over time. And we could look back to the history of 20th century America. Let's start there. We go further, but further back. But if you start there, those power dynamics are still at play. There's certain roles and types that have been produced and communicate very quickly certain ideas to people, both directly and indirectly. And those are things those kinds of tropes we see in film, we see in graphics, we hear in songs, and so forth and so on. And they continue to manifest, duplicate, multiply, morph in certain ways. So I'm not sure if I'm answering a question or I'm just sort of talking.
I think you're talking back to my to my statement about blanket generalizations about people. I do have another question for you that's not on the same topic. I know that you are right now working with a public figure. I wonder if you could talk to us about what it means to be working with an artist in another genre, and what it means to engage with larger publics than visual art generally does.
I'll start with the latter. I've never felt like my efforts were to communicate to a very narrow audience. I've always been interested in communicating to, or attempting to communicate to, as many as possible, as broad as possible, if a field of viewers, and that remains my interest. And with regards to working in other capacities, I mean, it's fascinating how other artists in different genres discover my work or become compelled by the work, the ideas, the images, or their perceptions of it. But I do try my best to think about in the broadest possible ways, what are the commonalities that we share. I'm not sure if you remember years ago, when you first came to Texas, we had a brief conversation And you said, so tell me about values. And I remember saying something, I was after values, American values, cultural values, subcultural values, trying to find out whether there's this overlap of things. I sort of feel like there's a river out before us, and anyone could sit there and watch the flow of the river, and things pass along the surface. The lightest trash, a piece of paper, will float by gently, perhaps at a quick pace. Another object might penetrate the surface, but some of it is above the surface, but nevertheless it flows by. There might be a tree, and a fallen tree, a large tree. Obviously, most of it, one could perceive it is beneath the surface, and it gradually moves by. I'm interested in what's beneath the river. I'm interested in what steers, what controls the flow. And I think that in every, generation, within every generation, there are certain concepts that are emphasized, are highlighted, illuminated more than others. And at the very core, these concepts affect the things that one might refer to as a trend that floats along the surface. Some things that might penetrate the surface, but gradually floats along. I'm interested in what are those core kinds of ideas that stimulate things that move, things that's on the surface.
There is a question from a viewer, a listener. Amy Brown Price is asking, could you mention the dimensions of the work? So maybe the thing to do is to talk about dimensions of work that you're working on now, and then maybe we can identify some of the dimensions of works from the past.
13 by 10 feet, 13 by 12 feet, 5 by 7, 3 by 4 feet. And I have some smaller pieces up. They vary. They vary.
Can we talk a little bit about the different mark making that you use? I mean, I think that there are kind of two types of mark making that often characterize your work. Some of it will be maybe kind of smaller strokes that do not show the hand of the artist. Others, on the other hand, might be a bit more fluid and show the mark making a bit more visibly. So could you talk about what makes you decide in which direction you're going to go?
Damn, that's impressive. I like to think it's more than just two, but that's impressive, Cherise. I would say it's the song, whether it's James Brown or Prince or whatever. I say that jokingly, but I listen and love music, and I think that there's certain types of rhythmatic patterns that one can create, whether the attempt is to make visible mark making or to exclude mark making. And sometimes it depends on the size of the image. It could be much more difficult to create something where one removes or attempts to remove the mark because it becomes more graphic and flat. And I'm a firm believer that the artist creates the context for the visual experience that the viewer partakes in. So the artist creates the frame. And there are, I think we, as people, there are multiple ways of interpreting or abstracting meaning, and so often than not, if we actually look a lot closer and at things than we would imagine, and we can understand the patterns to a certain degree. Some can have the ability to step back and be able to describe what these patterns are at play. Others cannot, right? But they understand, I believe. So I could increase in subtle ways visual movement with a shift from a warm to cool color, close in value, with a sort of a certain flick of the wrist in terms of mark making, or be more directional with mark making, whether it's directional moving the viewer into the space, the picture plane, out of the picture plane. They're different. Put it this way, if you look at Haitian art, there's an artist whose work I adore, Zafran, who's a contemporary Haitian painter.
Zafran.
Zafran, yes. And I had the pleasure of meeting him. He makes very difficult work, with a strong emphasis on the linear. And it's very difficult to balance that work. And he achieves movement both into the work as well as around the picture plane. And I look at Zafran's work in a way that's akin to that of Van Gogh's. If you remove yourself or the color and you're able to look at the length of the marks that he's making, directions of the marks that he's making, you get a different rhythmatic pattern that really contributes to the structure of the work in ways that is not often understood or talked about. With Zafran, it's not hidden; it's visually there. So I think there are ways that an artist can create subtle movement that could capture the imagination of the viewer in certain ways, not only with the subject matter, but with the mark making. That is akin to music.
Well, we are very nearly at a time when we will open it up. So I will ask you, do you have any questions for me?
I'd like to hear your thoughts on, the process of writing the book. If you could share some of those, and I'd also like to hear your thoughts about, now that the book is done, what are some things that you're working on?
Yeah, thanks for that. What am I working on now? I am working on another book now that I am tentatively calling Healing Old Wounds. And the keywords for that project are appropriation, conceptual practices, and the dealing with historic trauma and or events. And interestingly, your work was going to be a chapter in that book. And instead, I devoted an entire book to your work. And so there are 4 other artists that are going to be considered in this book, and they are Carrie Mae Weems, Charles Gaines, Rodney McMillan, and Colleen Smith. And there's a couple of works by each of them that I am focused on. With Weems, it's From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried. With Charles Gaines, it is Black Ghost Blues Redux. With Rodney McMillan, it is Shelter, which is also kind of subtitled Crawl. And then regarding Colleen Smith, it's called Remote Viewing. Anyway, all of these works kind of deal with the Jim Crow South, but from a remove, which is interesting to me. And the majority of them are either from California or have the kind of safe distance, and I'll put that in air quotes, in that California provides. So that's an answer to your second question. The process of writing the book. Wow. Well, I mean, you know, it's interesting. We worked together for, gosh, it might have been 10 or 11 years. And during that time, we thought about and tried to conceive something that we called Center for Art of African Diaspora. We invited a bunch of artists to come and give talks on campus. Together, in some capacity, we recruited students or trained students, whether I served on committees in studio art or you dialogued with people in art history. And during that time, I got to hear a lot about your work, and I got to think a lot about your work. And so when it was time to kind of adapt the writing of the book from one chapter that might have been about 50 pages long to, scale it up so that it was 250 pages, it didn't seem like such a problem to me, interestingly. It was a book that I'd kind of already sketched out, had an architecture structure for in my head. I knew that there were some key works like Sam, which is one of my favorite works of yours, that were really, really meaty and that kind of allowed for lots of both formal analysis and description of the visual work, but also the really thick contextualizing of the work that your paintings and other pieces allow for. So yeah, I mean, once I had the few key works, I felt like I could write the book. People say the book wrote itself. I won't go that far because it didn't quite write itself, but it was a book that wasn't really difficult to write. And I should say that one of the reasons why it wasn't difficult to write was that I had really important assistance with research and with production. And at this point, I want to shout out and thank Kara Carmack, who is hosting us today, who was my postdoctoral research assistant during the writing of the book. And she played a very foundational role in helping me to unearth and dig out archival gems that show up in the book. I will also say, by way of kind of winding down, that I happened to have a research leave that year, which made it possible to really sit down and do the work, which is not typical if you're at a Research One university like I am. And I was also writing it, as you well know, as my sister was dying of cancer, and as my father was being treated with chemo for his cancer, and he would die just 1 month before the book was published. And so I think there was something about having a distraction away from, to distract me away from these really, really heavy things that were happening. It was a good way to focus as I was myself experiencing trauma. So I will stop there.
Thank you both. It's always such a joy to hear art historians and artists who have known each other for a really long time and are really invested in each other's work speak to the sort of productivity that can come out of those relationships, Great. So thank you very much for that. Does anybody have any questions? Please feel free to put them into the Q&A. One question that I'm really curious about, having been familiar with this project and Cherise, your research, and Michael, your work, is the conversation that happened in the 90s, right, around representation, with your work emerging at the same time as someone like Kara Walker's work, and it's all kind of quite historical, quite conceptual. And then you have a sort of backlash to a slightly older generation by someone like Betty Saar or Howardina Pindell. And I wonder now, with how you see those conversations playing out now in the art world. Do you see them play out? Is there a generational divide? Is there an old guard, a new guard? And how are those conversations happening both in academia, but also for artists in the studio and in the gallery system, et cetera?
Well, as I look back and think about the 90s and the work that I was doing, I think the timing was right for my generation to be able to address the use of certain stereotypes in popular culture that have been pervasive since the 1800s. And I say that because as a child in the late 60s, I think with the construction of certain types of images dedicated for consumption by children, cartoons for cartoons, there was certain kinds of images that were coming through that were in effect affecting, I think, viewers. I will, for one, remember questioning why the bomb exploding and the figure has this black face and the character, and then the character looks directly at the camera. And what is that about? I question that. Why these narratives about the Civil War? I'm speaking specifically about Bugs Bunny, for example. I think and then if one looks back at films from the 70s, Roots, sort of a return or an interest in the construction of narratives about slavery, Goodbye Uncle Tom, Mandingo. There are a number of images, and also films through the blaxploitation media, which starts in the early 70s. I think my generation was ripe to deal with the stereotypes in a different way, but I also feel like the past generations didn't have they had a certain perspective, a certain take on the use and I would say psychological abuses of these images. So my perspective was one that was a different one. So I look back with more understanding and understand now how a lot of the issues that occurred back then regarding my rise and the rise of Kara's work, and what that energy, what might have fueled those energies. And I think it's simply a shift in terms of language. I've mentioned it before, what hip hop offers for my generation is a voice, a use of language that didn't exist prior. The youth can speak about, or could speak about, the youth and describe the environment that and story and tell its own story like never before. Black youth, for example, and that with confidence and fearlessness to a certain degree. So what I see now in the art world, one, there's more artists of color, and Black artists in particular, making work, and I'm thrilled and thankful that we, as a larger group of people, are accepting creativity in the form of art making, image making, like never before. That doesn't come without its challenges. There's still a need to continue to have dialogues about what's being produced, how it's being produced, and how it serves and reflects upon the culture that is produced within. But I'm thrilled by this more interest in the visual arts and creative production.
Kara, what was your question again? I mean, I think you were getting at perhaps generational differences then and now.
Exactly. Yeah. Thinking about the 90s and the sort of the swell that came up behind them, of the particular group of artists that Michael was a part of, to kind of challenge what they were doing. And I'm wondering if you're seeing anything comparable now, or if the same conversations are going on in different ways, or if this kind of wave is consistent, right? Kind of constant fluctuation of back and forth throughout generations.
I think so. I mean, I think that it remains a real vexing issue that people continue to come back to. And the way that artists are dealing with it now is different still, even than how artists were dealing with it in the 1990s. But it's also of a kind, or part of a cloth, however I should say that. I mean, there is still, not to go back to the art historian's tools, but it's still about iconography, and it's still about stories that are told through specific iconographies and figures. And, from the art historian's point of view, that's really interesting to me. Why those symbols, and why do they keep getting picked up over and over and over again? I think that's one of Michael's interests as well. But it is still happening, and it's different, but of a piece. There was someone who asked a question about the size of Michael Ray's work. So I thought that I might show images again, if that is okay with people. And I'm just going to show some works that I have in a slide. So Michael, do you want to talk about the size of Sam?
3 foot by 5 foot.
Okay. Beware.
3 foot by 5 foot. That was for the most part, that was more or less the standard size that I was quite comfortable working with.
And it's important to say that these are, many of them are works on canvas, and they're mostly
Paper.
Okay, paper in this instance, and in the Sam instance, right?
Yeah.
And on paper here, it's been kind of, what's the word? Not rusticated, but in some way aged physically in an instance like this. I see a frown on your face.
Mine? Oh, it's a question. No, as a kid, I was it turned out to be a really wonderful thing, because I used to collect pencils from the playground, the school ground, and oftentimes I was digging them out of the mud, and oftentimes the erasers were petrified. I couldn't use the erasers. But, the lead pencils I could draw. and in a way, it helped me to be really comfortable about my mark making and drawing in a range of ways that I wasn't dependent upon the eraser for corrections. One of the other interesting things about those pencils, when I would wash them underwater, I could feel the bits of pieces of mud or dirt that was still attached, and that residue, and perhaps in some way that contributed to an aesthetic preference for me. I mean, I have an affinity for things that have lived, things that are worn, torn, and I've tried to rationale these thoughts. And one of the things I could come up with, if one takes an injury early on in life, the memory remains if the scar is not visible, or the effects of that injury is not present. So life is about accumulation and layering and all of these things. And those were the concepts that helped to inform those images. So it was also freeing to be able to remove a layer, to peel back, and to a certain degree, it was informed by older things. But for me, and there were certain works that were more or less about trying to achieve a look that was old, but for the most part, it was an aesthetic preference and desire for me. It's just something that about the feeling of those pencils that still, and the stains that for me, I think are quite beautiful.
I'm just going through a couple of images so that viewers, listeners can see some of them.
Michael, you said that one of your upcoming shows will be largely sculpture.
Correct.
And I think you are primarily known as a painter. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your sculptural work and how you work in these two different mediums, and what they mean to you in different ways, and how you think about space and process.
Yeah. Well, this particular image, for example, required my dependence, as well as all of the sculptures actually, required my dependence upon others to contribute in ways that I never really envisioned. I always have this idea, I could conceive it, I could build it, and that was the first thing that I remember about engaging in sculpture, is that it is a process that that I had to rely upon others to participate in, and really it's a concept that was grounded me to a certain degree when working on Bamboozled. All these different creatives that were coming from different films that they had been working on, and they do their part and they were moving on in a short time, and thinking about the collective effort that took place. Damon, we had some really wonderful conversations. The sculptures, for me, I think about the flat image as well as the three-dimensional image. They're not the same, but believe it or not, my approach to the large sculpture that's at Texas, University of Texas currently, with the Crutches, it's the same process of investigation of materials and to best represent the ideas that I was interested in communicating. And in this particular case, the space was very important. What remained, which was that exterior wall, the significance of that and the history of the institution, I didn't want any of the weathering that had existed on that wall, which was once outside, to be removed.
Can I just butt in here and to say that the Black and Latino Studies building is in a rehabilitated building that had formerly been geography. And when Black and Latino Studies moved into it, claimed it, the old building that had been geography had been renovated, and then a new wing had also been added. And so what he's talking about is, and what you can see in this slide, I'll use my cursor here to try to show you, is that this is the outside of the original external building, and this is where the new wing has been added on to this older building. And so in designing this sculpture, he also worked with the architects to design this space such that the old and the new would be in conversation.
Very well said. No, you completed it.
Great. Well, does anyone have one final question for Michael and Cherise? It's always so fun to hear you two talk. Great. Okay, well, we're right on time. Who would have thought? So just to send out a final closing, thank you all for joining us, and a very deep thanks. Sure.
Sorry, I think there's a question.
Oh, super. Oh, why the crutches? Great
Good question.
Yeah, the crutches, this was a really large project and a very important project initially, and there was a certain percentage that went to Cherise, you might be able to help me.
Yeah, so Landmarks is the public art program on the University of Texas at Austin campus. And with each new build, I think it's 2% of the budget goes to creating a public artwork to be housed inside and or around the new building. And so when Black and Latino Studies was constructed, the 2% was given over to Landmarks in order to commission an artist to make a sculpture or to make a project. Michael was chosen and he decided to make a sculpture.
Well, it wasn't much I could do in that space. I mean, the space defined what could exist there. There were height restrictions. It's a narrow space. And as I began to conceive what type of work to put into place, I had thought about who occupied the space, and it was Black scholars, young and seasoned scholars. And what do these scholars do? They shape language. They create knowledge or information. They how do I describe it? They don't create knowledge, but they create, identify, research, identify, structure information in a way that's palatable and meaningful relative to certain types of issues and that are significant, important. It's not knowledge in my mind until it's applicable, understood and applied, but that's what these scholars do. And the tools that they use are words. And that led to me thinking of the structure of the designing of letters. And there were some other things happening with the project. There was moments where resources that were applied for the construction project was, to best of my knowledge, removed. So I felt that in attempts that the institution was making an attempt to assist in developing this space, but at the same time, there was it wasn't giving these ethnic studies would it actually needed long-term in terms of space. So I thought that effort or that moment was was serving as such of a sort of a crutch, and wordplay led to an investigation to use of crutches.
And I say that from the art historical point of view, I'm interested in how crutches become stand-ins for actual bodies, one, and two, that they are prostheses that enable injured bodies to continue to be mobile. And so there's, you know, a really interesting bodily association that comes with the crutches. What you probably couldn't see in those pictures, or maybe you could, is that they are constructed in kind of a hub and spoke. So they are in some ways kind of star figures, and then they are organized in kind of a whirling dervish or a tornado or a rhizome, but you know, a kind of diagonally turning object. And so they're organized in this diagonally turning form, moving through the space and kind of undulating at the same time. So it's a pretty spectacular work. We enjoy living with it in the Black and Latino Studies building, and almost every year someone will do their faculty headshot in front of the in front of the sculpture.
Cherise, you should write about that piece.
I should. Good thing I did.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, we got a thank you from Carolyn in the Q&A. Thank you.
Let me state that, interestingly, during the process of trying to find enough crutches, wooden crutches, I discovered that I can only buy crutches that were made with some wood from Alibaba at the time, at least in that large amount. And Alibaba was in China, and it was very difficult to find wooden crutches. And the suggestion, or what was implied to me, was that in America there was a change where crutches were now being done with lightweight aluminum. So I thought that was interesting. A moment for me working with trying to find wooden crutches to use.
I will say one last thing. I was there when it was constructed and installed, and it was a heartwarming sight to see 3 Black men installing this massive sculpture in the Black and Latino building, Black and Latino Studies building. It was a nice sight. Yeah.
I wonder if you have any pictures, any photos of that.
I don't.
Yeah. I didn't take any either.
Yeah. Kara, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Just thinking about this missing photograph. It's one of those archival finds that scholars down the road will be digging through the institutional files, trying to find installation photos. On to the next graduate assistant, right, Cherise?
Yes.
Well, a very deep thanks to you, Michael Ray Charles, Cherise Smith. Oh, we have a really lovely thank you.
Oh, in the Q&A we do?
In the Q&A, yes.
Oh,
Andy
nice.
Campbell says, thank you both for your time and candor. It was a pleasure to hear more about the book and forthcoming shows.
Oh, thanks for coming out, Andy. One thing I want to mention is that Kara hunted down a suite of stained glass in a church in Brooklyn. And so you all who are still here, you could go and find Michael Ray's stained glass sculpture.
Exactly. It's very fun. Let me know. Send me an email and I'll send you a Google Maps to the church. It's phenomenal. Super. Well, thank you again. What a lovely, wonderful conversation. Excited to hear all of the work that you're doing and continue to do. For everyone who has so kindly tuned in this evening for our inaugural event of the fall, please join us tomorrow evening for a panel discussion on the artist Leland Bell, one of the founding teachers at the New York Studio School and the subject of the current exhibition in the main gallery. You can also check out the rest of the exciting fall 2022 evening lecture series lineup on our website. And thank you and good night.